In my previous video, I talked about how maybe, just maybe, floppy disks weren't quite as terrible as we remember them being. In this video, I'm going to pick up basically where I left off, and I'm going to kind of give a tour of my personal collection of external floppy drives. I started thinking that was just going to be a couple, but it turns out I've got a lot of those things, and I'm not even going to show all of them because I have a lot of duplicate drives and a bunch of other stuff that isn't really worth showing, like, a whole bunch of modern USB floppy drives. Not even worth it. But first, I'm going to pick up on something else that I had kind of offhand mentioned in the previous video. So I'm going to go ahead and start there, and then we'll dig into the old floppy drives. So in my previous video about floppy drives, I mentioned that I spent a lot of time one summer at the Salem Public Library in the computer lab, and part of what I did there was make character sheets for Dungeons and Dragons. Well, I found my box of old D&D stuff, and there were some character sheets in it. Now, this isn't that original 1986 character sheet. This character was created in January of 1988, so this is a much later revision of the revision of the character sheet, but it's pretty similar. This was all done in Mac Paint because that was the only piece of software on the Mac that wasn't a game that I knew how to use and that I could basically just figure out how to use on my own without any manuals or without having anyone show me how to use it. So this was what I had come up with, and so you could see all kinds of super rough spots of it. Like here the ammo boxes are not done very well, and a bunch of stuff is fairly terrible, but I mean, it's not a terrible layout. It got the job done. It had all the stuff packed in, and they had a printer there. This one looks like it's a Xerox copy, so we probably I think by this time one of my friends had a Mac, and we recreated my original character sheets on his Mac and then printed off one and then took them someplace to get a bunch of photocopies made. So by this time, I was mostly the dungeon master, so I didn't really have any characters of my own. So this was one of my friends. I held on to, as the DM, I held on to all the character sheets so that one time we had a problem where someone showed up to play D&D and like, oh crap, I don't have the folder that has my character sheets in it. So after that, like, the DM just always kept the character sheets, so we never have that problem again. So as bad as this handwriting is, which tells me exactly whose character this was, I won't call him out, even though I haven't seen him for many years. It's the handwriting is still better than mine would have been. So the other thing about this version of the character sheet is it had a bunch of stuff on the back, and I'm pretty sure that the original version was just single-sided, and that after a while we had started making notes of things on the backside. So then that was what led to the revision that had some other stuff. So I just wanted to, since I figured out where maybe these things were hiding, I thought I'd come back to that real quick before actually digging into the meat of this video. So this is the vast majority of my collection of external floppy drives. Like I mentioned in my previous video, almost every computer system in the 80s had a variety of external floppy drives available for it. At the far end, there are a bunch of drives that were available for Commodore 8-bit computers. For the most part, they would all work with the VIC-20 and the Commodore 64 and the 128, and a bunch of them even with the PET. And I believe they would all also work with the Plus 4 and that whole line. I think the The floppy drives were the one set of peripherals that actually worked with those. Then we have a couple of external drives for the Commodore Amiga. This drive is kind of cool because it's actually the drive that was supposed to go with the Amiga CD TV, even though I don't have a CD TV. They also made an identical drive that was in the regular Amiga beige color. The only difference was the color, and now what it costs to buy one used on eBay. Below it is an external Amiga drive that I bought some years ago, but the drive itself was all gunked up, and at that time I didn't really know how to service a drive. So instead of fixing it, I pulled the drive out and I put a Gotek in it, so it's kind of my Gotek that I share among all my Amigas. Have a couple of Atari 8-bit drives, including the original 810 that is just a beast. This Indus GT drive is kind of cool because it comes with this huge hard plastic carrying case. That was kind of neat. And then a few, I guess what I would consider PC drives. This is an iOmega Floppy Plus, and it's kind of interesting because in addition to the floppy, it's got a couple additional ports for compact flash card and micro SSDs. And then there's another PC external floppy drive that's kind of neat because it's actually a PC MCIA drive. And the thing that's kind of cool about this is there's a spot here where you can store a floppy drive, and then the cable and the PC MCIA connector kind of tucks in nicely to keep it all sort of contained. I thought that was kind of cute. This is an external floppy drive for some of the original Tandy 1000 computers. This one specifically I got some years ago when I bought a Tandy 1000 EX, which I sold because I also have an HX, and this is for use with the HX. They're compatible. And some of the rest of these drives I'm going to pull up and talk about in a little bit more detail. And there's another drive that was so huge it would not fit in this shot, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a moment. So the first drive that I want to talk about, I'm just going to talk about it very briefly, is the 1541C. Now, it's really just a plain old 1541, but the color scheme has been updated to match the redesigned Commodore 64C and the Commodore 128. But as far as I know, other than that, it's identical to the existing 1541 drives. Now, this specific drive is a little bit interesting and maybe weird. I'm not sure what its deal is because I have another much nicer 1541C, and the drive colors are different. The drives are otherwise identical, and the lights are in the same place and everything else, and obviously this one on the bottom is pretty yellowed, but I don't know why one got the dark colored disk drive and the other got the light colored disk drive. And I've seen a bunch of other ones like this, and I don't remember having seen ones with the dark drive. Is that normal? I don't know. Respond in the comments below. I think I may have tricked someone into giving me their 1541C box, not this box, another box that I have, because the drive that was in it also had a dark colored drive, except I think the drive, I think that was actually a regular 1541, but I don't remember, and I'm second guessing myself now, and I might have to give him his box back. Hopefully he'll forgive me. So I wanted to talk about one more drive from the Commodore 8-bit line. So here we have the 1541C from the previous segment, and a plain old regular 1541. And here we have this interesting thing. Now, it looks pretty similar to the the original 1541. They have a very similar case badge. But this is a different kind of animal. Now, a lot of people think this is the SFD 100i, but the trailing one on the 1541 on both the original and the C version also lacks the tail. So this is definitely SFD 1001. Now they look pretty similar, but as soon as we flip it around, we can see that this is a very different animal. Now, we can also definitely see SFD 1001 clearly on the badge on the back. And this? So this is an IEEE 488 bus connector. This is the same drive interface used on the original Commodore PET line. Unlike the drive interfaces used on all of the later Commodore 8-bit computers, this is a parallel bus. And it goes by several different names. IEEE 488, GPIB, or I believe the original name was HPIB because it was the bus was originally developed at Hewlett-Packard. They used it with a number of computers and a bunch of test equipment and all kinds of stuff. It was a very flexible bus. It was maybe the USB of the late 70s, early 1980s. So, being that this was a parallel bus instead of a serial bus, this drive interface is much faster than the drive interface on the 1541 drives, or even on the 1571 or the 1581, even with a fast loader or Jiffy DOS or any kind of accelerator. I believe that some sources say that disk transfer speeds were approximately 5 times as fast. So that's a pretty good speed up. In addition, these are double-sided drives that store pretty close to exactly 0.5 megabyte per side. So the disks are 1 megabyte, and I think that there's some kind of MFM encoding, whereas the 1541 drives don't use MFM. I don't remember exactly what the encoding is, but it's different. It's its own special magic thing. So my understanding is that these drives, with their higher speed and their higher capacity, were fairly popular among BBS operators who wanted to store all their download files on one or two of these drives, instead of having to have potentially a bunch of 1541s and swap disks around, or I don't even know what you would do. But having so much more capacity on the floppy disks was a boon to them, apparently. Now, these will work natively on a PET, and there are adapters that will let you use IEEE 488 bus on Commodore 64s and 128s. As far as I'm aware, most of them you connect through the user port, and so I think they should be compatible with VIC-20, but I don't know that for sure. You might have to develop some special software or do something. I don't really know for sure. Different ones of those interfaces had different quirks. For example, the IEEE 48 card made by Commodore, if you used that card and one of these drives, you could not use any serial connected drives. And that seems like a huge bummer. Some of the third-party adapters would allow you to use an SFD 1001 with 1541s or 1581s or whatever. But at least one or two of those required that you connect some wire from the card itself to somewhere inside the computer because it needed to connect to some other sync line or something. So it required some minor modification to the computer itself. Now, I got this as part of a lot that I split with someone else, and that lot had another one of these drives. It had one of the non-Commodore adapters, and there was a lot of stuff in the lot. So when I split this lot with someone, and he got the other drive and the adapter. So I haven't really had a chance to play with this yet, but I would really like to. I'm very interested in things that use that GPIB bus. So when I was younger, it always confused me. Why is this the mini disk? Right? There's two kinds of floppy disks. There's this one, and there's the one that's smaller than this. Why is this the mini disk? That always confused me. But it turns out there is another. So, by comparison, yeah, this is a mini disc, and this is a giant honkin', like, this is a disc of ridiculous size. I mean, just everything about these is crazy. Now, what, pray tell, would you put one of those in? Oh, God. Well, one of these, of course. And this thing is ridiculously heavy. Like, I wasn't playing when I groaned when I picked it up just now. This thing is a beast. And unlike most, 1541 drives are pretty heavy. But all of that weight is the power supply. I mean, if you take the power supply out of one of them, they weigh nothing. It's the drive. Like, the motor in these drives is massive. It's huge. And the thing I love about this drive is the huge, chunky power switch. Yeah, so this is a huge drive. I got it many, many years ago. My dad was working at a company that did office moves around in the Portland area, and sometimes when tech companies were throwing stuff out, he'd bring home junk for me to work on and play with and tinker around with. And he called me up one day and said, "Yeah, I'm gonna bring you home a disk drive. I think you'll be pretty excited about it. It's pretty big." Like, "Oh, cool. I need a drive. All right, yeah." And he brings this home. Nice guy. And I've had this as basically a decoration everywhere I've lived since then. And that was, I don't know, maybe 1993, 1994, somewhere in that kind of area. So here's the back of this. Regular power connector. Huge ribbon cable connector to connect to the drive. And you can see in a little bit. Let me see if I can zoom in without destroying everything here. So you can see inside a little bit. I've never opened this. I probably should someday. There's a rather large power supply in there, but it's all like, this is physically the back of the actual drive itself. Like, the drive is just a monster. Yeah, I think I turned it on. So here's a tested by tag that I just noticed. It says 210, which in the United States would mean February 10th, 1988. I work with a lot of Europeans where that would mean October 2nd. Just to be clear. Whoa, God. Oh, and it's dirty back there. I think I turned it on once, and when it turned on, it spun up. But I don't. At the time, I didn't have any discs. I've found some since, but I still don't have any way to connect this to anything. I think it'd be kind of fun to try to connect it to something, and I don't know what. Run up my power bill, probably. So yeah, so this is by, in case it wasn't really readable, Flagstaff Engineering is the badge label here on this device. This is definitely the most weird stuff drive in my collection Although the next drive, in my opinion, gives it a pretty good run for its money. Really quickly, before I move on to that other drive, earlier in the video, I threw some shade at the Atari 810 about how big it was. Let me show you why. Here we have this massive 8-inch drive, this behemoth that weighs a ton. There's the 810 for size comparison. They're basically the same size. Why is this 5¼ inch drive the same size as a massive brick, boat anchor, behemoth, whatever word you want to use, of an 8-inch drive? Why you gotta be so big? Doesn't make any sense to me. So that's why I threw some shade at this drive. I'm sure a lot of people have fond memories of using them and the later Atari drives, but this one, it's hard for me to accept that it's so enormous. So that's why I was throwing shade at it. So the last drive that I wanted to look at from my collection is one that I picked up at a completely absurd hoarder estate sale, I don't know, probably 4 years ago or something. And when I found it, I saw it from this angle. And I looked at it and I thought, oh, it's a SCSI enclosure. Okay, that's cool. I mean, those are useful. I have plenty of old computers that have SCSI interfaces that I can connect things to. And so I pulled it out of the box and I turned it around. What? A SCSI? Why? Why is this a thing? What kind of computer has SCSI that you would want a 360K floppy disk on that doesn't have some other sort of built-in floppy controller that you would just connect a 360K floppy disk drive to? I have never understood why this thing exists. I understand that it can exist and that SCSI is a very flexible bus that can do all kinds of things. But why? this and especially for 360K. Like, I would get it for a high density floppy because, some old computers that could have SCSI, maybe their firmware, BIOS or whatever you want to call it, couldn't handle those higher density drives, so you would have to connect it over something else. Like, that would make sense to me. But this? What the heck? This boggled my mind from the day I first laid eyes on it. So after I brought it home, I remember I took it apart and looked around inside of it and then put it back together, and it's gone back in a box and I haven't done anything with it. Part of the difficulty with it is it has some kind of a funky power connector. Now, I'm sure that it's just ground, 5 volts and 12 volts because it's running a floppy drive. Like, there isn't very much else that it reasonably could need. So my plan for the follow-up video to this is I'm going to take it apart, we'll look inside of it, I'll see if I can cobble together some kind of a power supply for it. I'm sure if I just build an adapter to plug into like an Molex connectors on a regular PC style power supply, I should be able to get power into this thing. I have plenty of reasonably modern computers that have PCI SCSI controllers in it, so I can connect this up to something. And, let's see if in Linux or whatever I can read and write some 360K. It's almost impossible for me to say that with a straight face. The concept is just so absurd, but that's why it has to happen. So I think that's going to wrap up for this video. I'm going to pick up with this drive and tearing it apart and hopefully getting it working on on a modern computer, because, you know, I my modern 64-bit CPU based computers with many processor cores, some of those motherboards actually don't have floppy controllers on them. So maybe it's not completely ridiculous. I don't know. It's just it makes me laugh every time I even think about it. So I'm gonna leave it there, and we'll pick back up with the teardown and seeing if I can cobble together a power supply and get this thing running. That'll be the next video. So until then, try to remember the good stuff.